is Connie Hassett. I'm a Princeton Adult School Board member, and it's my very great privilege to introduce tonight's speaker. I will be telling you about Karen Elliott House, but honestly, I have to admit, I feel completely redundant. Many of you probably saw the fabulous full-page feature in the Sunday Times Book Review 10 days ago, November 18th, with a big picture of Karen. Big picture of Karen. Anyway, the reviewer, Michael Totten, gave a rave review to Karen's new book. On Saudi Arabia, its people, past, religion, fault lines, and future. He summarized, he quoted, he endorsed Karen's view of Saudi Arabia as, grimly, a country that needs a radical overhaul. Totally preempted by Mr. Totten's review, I will nevertheless proceed to tell you about tonight's speaker. Karen Elliott House is a retired publisher of the Wall Street Journal and former senior vice president of Dow Jones and Company. In that dual capacity, she was responsible for all news, editorial, sales, and other business functions of the Wall Street Journal, as well as its editions in Asia and Europe, and also the magazine and television ventures overseas. And of course, as a newswoman and journalist, Karen House was and remains a writer. She is a prize-winning reporter and editor with many awards. These include 1, a Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting for her coverage of the Middle East. 2, Overseas Press Club Awards for coverage of the Middle East and of specifically Islam. Next, or in addition, an Edwin M. Hood Award for Excellence in Diplomatic Reporting for her series on Saudi Arabia. Karen House has traveled widely and interviewed many world leaders. I'll itemize only 8 of them. You'll recognize the names. The late Saddam Hussein, Vladimir Putin, Shimon Peres, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Saudi King Abdullah, former President of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, the late King Hussein, the late Yasser Arafat. I'm emphasizing the former and the late with these names just to give you what you all know, an indication of how tremendously volatile this portion of the world is. You'll see in her book on Saudi Arabia that Karen House has also interviewed many of the current Saudi princes. These are nice gentlemen. Some of them are part of the problem. And Karen is an academic as well, with credentials that include time at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. And let me say this next with all due respect. Karen House is a talking head. You might well have seen her over the past 3 decades on Washington Week in Review, on Meet the Press, on Face the Nation. You might have seen her more recently on PBS, on Fox, on CNN, on CNBC. She has addressed many audiences in the United States and abroad as an expert on international relations. Finally, 3 quick personal details. Karen House, you'll tell by her voice immediately, her lovely voice. She's a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin. She is married and the mother of 4 children. She lives here in Princeton. You might see her at McCaffrey's. Karen Elliott House is speaking tonight on Islam in Saudi Arabia. Please welcome Karen Elliott House.
After an introduction that nice, I feel like I can only go downhill. If you need a translator, maybe Connie can provide, but hopefully you will be able to decipher most of my Texas accent. I'm going to start with my 3 themes of the night, and then hopefully by the end they will be clear, and if not, you can question me or challenge any of them. The first is that Islam in Saudi Arabia is not really a religion, it's a way of life. Religious rules dominate every aspect of one's life, from prayer to women's menstruation to going to war. The second is that the purpose of religion as a way of life is really to perpetuate the monarchy, or at least to make criticism of it anti-Islamic. And the third is that the Wahhabi Islam, which is one of the, as I try to describe in the book, 3 pillars of stability in Saudi Arabia, is fraying under the onslaught of politicization, among other things. Wahhabism gets its name from a man, not surprisingly, named Ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was a jurist in the 18th century, who supposedly, I assume he had, memorized the entire Quran at the time he was 10. He had very deep religious convictions, and his belief was that Arabia had lost the Islam of the Prophet, and what it needed was to return to the pure Islam of the Prophet and what Muslims call the 4 rightly guided caliphs, the caliphs that came immediately after Muhammad to lead the faithful. Mr. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's preaching of this religion was not particularly popular to people who had slipped into more pagan ways and more freewheeling personal liberties. So he was looking for a protector to protect him as he preached this brand of Islam when he met Mohammed Saud, the founder of the current Saudi dynasty. And Mr. Mohammed Al Saud was an ambitious tribal leader who was interested in conquering as much of Arabia as he could for his greater power. So the marriage between these two of I'll protect you and you'll promote me was made in the 18th century, and sure enough it proved more potent than the Al Saud sword wielded in the name of political power. Wielded in the name of religion, it was more successful. And the first Saudi state was founded in 1745 with the combination of these 2 men, one looking after politics and the other looking after the religious life of the people. And that combination and their descendants have ruled Saudi Arabia off and on, mostly on, since 1745. But the version of Wahhabi Islam, at least according to Mr. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's biographies, the version practiced today is even more austere than what he preached, in that he did not require women to veil. He did allow women to meet their future husbands before marriage, and he was at least said to have opposed wife beating. In a secular country like this, it's almost impossible for us to imagine how pervasive religion is in Saudi Arabia. Every airport, every hotel, every office building, every school has rows of prayer rugs where people can kneel and follow the right direction to pray in the direction of Mecca. Every hotel room has a little mark on the desk, on the bed, somewhere in the room, telling you what direction Mecca is for praying. Indeed, some new cars come with complimentary prayer rugs, so that if you're driving and need to stop and pray alongside the road, you can take out your complimentary rug. They have these mutawa, or religious police, who monitor and enforce a strict form of Islamic behavior on the streets. I have been told, cover your head, you're in Saudi Arabia. Just as an aside, when I am there, I wear my long black abaya and I keep my scarf around my neck in case some religious policeman says, cover your head, you're in Saudi Arabia, so you can whip it up. And if you go see religious people, which I thought would be one of the disadvantages of being a woman, otherwise being a woman is an advantage because you can see both men and women in Saudi Arabia. But some of the senior religious people were willing to meet an infidel like me if I covered my face, which I was willing to do to see them. In the schools are also perpetuated by religion because education is one of the preserves of the Wahhabi descendants, education, the Ministry of Justice. So young children are indoctrinated if their parents are doing the wrong thing to correct their parents. And I went on a picnic with a family who the parents were educated in the U.S. And at the end of the evening, after we've eaten our chicken kebab cooked on the fire, the family lines up in the, there was a full moon, lines up in the moonlight to pray, and they're all moving in perfect unison, bending, kneeling, etc. And when it was over, and I'm sitting on the rug, the little 6-year-old boy came over to me and said, I have to teach you something. And I said, sure, what? And he said, do you know what to say when the angel of death comes? And he could tell I did not. So he said, he says, who is your God? And you say, Allah. And he says, who is your prophet? And you say, Muhammad. And he says, what is your faith? And you say, Islam. And he says, what is your works? And you say, I heard and I believed. And Muslims believe this interview occurs as soon as you're buried and the mourners are walking away, that this interview occurs, and if you successfully pass, you are borne aloft and shown heaven, and a window on heaven is open for you, and you go back and lie in your grave awaiting the judgment day. And if you do not pass this interview, you are pulverized and then put back together and pulverized and reconstituted until the judgment day. So this sweet little kid wanted to save me from that fate. And I'm from a tiny town in Texas that went with 4 churches and 1 blinking red light, and went to church often, every Sunday and every Wednesday. But at 6, I was not concerned about the salvation of myself that I can remember, let alone strangers. And to try to get a closer look at this conservative Islam in Saudi Arabia, I lived with a woman whom I had met. She had translated for me with an imam's family. And since I do not speak Arabic, I obviously wanted someone who spoke English, but who was not Western educated and modernized, and this lady certainly fit the bill. She lived on the second floor, and her husband's first wife lived on the first floor. And they had 8 children, and she had 7 children. And he came up one day and down the next, and up and down. And when he came up, I had to hide in my room because he was a proper religious man who would not obviously mix with a woman that he was not related to. Indeed, in the time I spent with her, I was never introduced to him. He did pick us up one night, and we all came out completely covered in black, and I sat directly behind him in the car, but I could have been Casper the Friendly Ghost. There was never, a word said. I was invisible. But all this lady wanted to do, and she's quite typical of the conservative, and Saudi Arabia still is a very conservative society. She was very typical of those people. Her whole focus in life was on doing the right thing, getting her family to paradise. She had no interest in driving. She had no interest in going out. We went out once to her sister's house, and once when she tried to convert me, she took me to a Islamic center where others could do what she hoped, what she had failed to do. But her daughters, too, were very accepting of this. I asked her daughter, how do you think your life will be different from your mother's? And she said, my mother is doing everything possible to give me a life exactly like hers. Now, my 17-year-old is not saying that to me with any admiration or acceptance. But I think these girls have been reared, and it was a very sincere answer. The country's religious establishment is headed by 20 senior ulama who comprise the Senior Council of Ulama. They are appointed by the king and paid by the government and can be fired by the king. So they have a very symbiotic relationship, the royal family and the religious establishment. The religious are fond of telling the Saudi people, you must obey the ruler even if he's not to your liking. And they quote a hadith from the Prophet, you must obey the ruler even if he is a raisin-headed Abyssinian, because the believer, like a camel, goes where he is led. So you are not justified in overthrowing your ruler unless you are truly convinced that he's disobeying God. The king calls himself the custodian of the 2 holy mosques, not king, which is simply another way, obviously, of wrapping oneself in Islam. And this king has continued a long tradition of using Islam to perpetuate Al Saud rule. After the Prophet died, he was succeeded quite rapidly by 4 men, 3 of whom were murdered by fellow Muslims. So the religion had divisions almost from the start. One of those was his son-in-law Ali, and the murder of Ali, who the Shias believe was the right follower, should have been the leader immediately after Muhammad, because it should have gone through the Prophet's bloodline, not just to what was deemed by the community of believers to be the most righteous man among them. And that's still the Shia-Sunni split, which I think you all have had a program on in this series?
No.
Or no? No? And then finally there came a successor, the fifth caliph after Muhammad, who founded a dynasty that lasted for 100 years. And he lasted for 20. And someone asked him, how did you achieve such longevity when your predecessors, so many of them, did not last very long? And he said, I hold a hair between me and my people. When they pull, I yield. When they yield, I pull. And it is still very much the way religion is used in the Al Saud deal with the Saudi people to push toward consensus and to yield when people are unhappy and to take back much of what's been yielded at the first opportunity. This glue of Islam, which has held together Arabia under a very different brand of Islam than most other Islamic countries practice, is weakening, in my view, for several reasons. One, the Al Saud have politicized Islam. They have used it to do the things they would like to do and have the religious ulama endorse them. And that has caused Saudi people to say, the religious establishment is more interested in doing the bidding of Abdullah than of Allah. For instance, they issued a fatwa endorsing bringing American troops into Saudi Arabia after Saddam invaded Kuwait. And for many fundamentalist Saudis, having infidels brought into the land of the Prophet was a heinous thing to do, and yet the religious establishment endorsed it. When King Abdullah opened a big new university near Jeddah in 2009 that mixes men and women, Saudi men and women, and Saudi men and women with foreign men and women. That was a very, in many people's mind, un-Islamic thing to do, particularly when the religious establishment preaches the need to keep the sexes segregated and has the religious police out enforcing that. So when one of the senior ulama was asked on a TV call-in show, is this right? He said no, and the king fired him. And then suddenly any number of the other senior ulama discovered that the Prophet had had his hair washed by women, that there were various reasons that this could be okay. And then the head of the religious police in Mecca announced that he wasn't going to enforce the rules against mixing, so he was fired by the head of the religious police, and then the king intervened to save the man in Mecca. So all of these disputes within the religious establishment have played out publicly, and not to the greater enhancement of the religious establishment. Secondly, thanks to the internet and satellite TV, young Muslims, as well as older ones, but young Muslims and 60% of Saudi Arabia is under 20 years of age. Young people are hearing other views and other versions of Islam, other than the one that the government propagates. When I first started going there in 1978, there was the Saudi TV channel, and it basically had prayer all day long. Now you can see Fox, CNN, BBC, Cairo TV, Syrian TV, everything. And people can obviously go on the internet. So the lock on what is the proper Islam has been broken as people access other views. And also the religious establishment has to deal with issues that the Prophet Muhammad didn't have to be concerned about. For instance, one of the senior religious ulama that I was able to meet, who's very popular with young people because he's pragmatic, and he was asked by one young man, is it proper to eat a penguin? And the sheikh said, if you can find one in Saudi Arabia, eat it. That kind of humor has endeared him to young people. But one of the things he also had to rule on was, is it proper to take a cell phone into the toilet if the Quran is downloaded on your cell phone? And he said yes, because every Muslim's mind should have the Quran downloaded in it. So therefore, if it's downloaded in your cell phone, that's okay. But beyond the divisions within the religious establishment, there are also other religious voices emerging in Saudi Arabia, and that some propose a kind of gentler version of Islam, and obviously some an even more rigid version. There is one particularly charismatic sheikh who's kind of become a single-handed media empire. He was imprisoned in the 90s by the royal family for opposing U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. And after 5 years, he was let out, and he has moderated his view, but he's moderated from criticizing them from the right to criticizing them from the left, if you will, for any number of inadequacies and inefficiencies. And he is another very popular voice with young Saudis. And even students, young men at the Imam University, which is their premier university for training religious scholars. I met with some of these young men, and I asked them, who do you listen to? Who's the right guide for your daily life when you have questions? And one of them said, I read the Quran, I decide for myself. That's, in their view, a Western answer. You shouldn't decide for yourself. You should be following the proper Islam. The other reason I think the Islamic pillar is cracking is because young Saudis also see the big gap between the way Islam is preached and the way it's practiced in Saudi Arabia. They see palaces that stretch for blocks and wonder what that has to do with the humility and equality preached by the Prophet. They see the king sending 100,000 Saudi students, including Saudi women, abroad on scholarship to mix with foreigners in poor schooling being provided at home, and wonder why can't, if it's okay to mix in these Western institutions, why can't we have those Western institutions come here, the way Qatar has had some Western universities set up there, so more of us could get a better education. They hear that you must not have art and you must not create human likenesses, and yet every piece of money you hold has pictures of the Saudi royals on it. So all of this has created a real cynicism among many young people. Not yet subversion, but deep cynicism. So in conclusion, the religious ritual is still very strong. People go to the mosque and they are followed up and asked why they did not go to the mosque if you're a man. And this is, they pray in unison and everybody is largely dressed alike, so you have the impression of harmony, but the religious voices are increasingly discordant, not harmonious. Aside from the Al Saud, the religious establishment, the Wahhabi Islamic establishment, is still the major force for stability in the kingdom, other than the Al Saud and oil wealth, which is what buys the loyalty of people. Excuse me. And the religious establishment, through 70,000 mosques in the country, are by far the most organized and only organized group, aside obviously from the royal family. All of these three pillars are cracking. I mean, I'm talking only about Islam tonight, but in the book I talk about the royal family's succession from the band of brothers that have ruled since the founder died, and they're now elderly and must somehow select the son of one of them, which is a lot easier said than done when there are hundreds of grandsons. And I also talk about the oil wealth pillar, because the consumption of energy in the kingdom is rising dramatically, and exporting oil is still, despite all the 5-year plans of the last 35 years, it's still where 90% of the revenue comes from, that allows the family to maintain at least acquiescence, if not loyalty to the people. So if anyone wants to ask about the other pillars, I'm happy to talk about that too, but I focused on the Islamic pillar since that was our subject tonight. And I look forward to taking questions. Yes, sir.
Would you say a word about the immigrant people in Saudi Arabia, and how they relate to the Saudi nation?
The question was, would I say something about the foreign imported workers in Saudi Arabia and how they relate to Saudis? Excuse me. I'm sorry. 90% of all the employees in the private sector in Saudi Arabia are foreigners. So there are roughly 19 million Saudis and another 8 million foreigners in the country. most of them are Muslims, and increasingly Muslims from Southeast Asia as opposed to Arabs, so Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Indians. And they don't relate much. Saudis tend to look through them, past them. For instance, women are not allowed to work around men. A few years ago, they had this idea that we'll create jobs for women by allowing them to sell lingerie to women, instead of a Saudi woman having to stand there and buy from a Pakistani man. And the conservative Saudis basically killed the idea for another 6 years. It has finally been instituted this year. And they don't regard, a Saudi woman buying something from a Saudi man or riding in a Pakistani or Bangladeshi man, or riding in a car with her Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian driver. They're not really regarded as full humans, if you will, so it's okay. Because their view is that women are the aggressors and, they're the ones who are out to rape men. So no Saudi woman would obviously be interested in a non-Saudi man. So it's all right to have this driver or to buy your bra from a Bangladeshi. But there's not mostly, some of these people earn very high wages, but most of them are, working in hotels, working in construction, doing the jobs that Saudis will not do. So there's most largely overlooked. And they can be sent home at a moment's notice, so they're not seen as a threat by anybody. This lady.
You talked a minute about a class society. I think that's when I was working in London, there were whole hotels of Saudis who were there living or on vacation in a Western lifestyle. I don't know if that's upper class or just a royal family, or how does this all work?
Well, anybody that can afford it can leave the country. That's part of the vow of preservation of their way of life and monarchy is that, people who can afford it can go anywhere they can get a visa. Some of you may have seen here that in the last week, if a Saudi woman leaves, they're now sending electronic messages to husbands and fathers that if the women they're responsible for, exit the country, they monitor this and now send notices to track the women. But you can leave if you can afford it. One of the kind of poignant quotes in my book is from a Saudi prince who went to Syracuse and who was the first Saudi or only Arab astronaut. He went up in 1984. The U.S. Sent him up, and he's the son of the current crown prince. He said, we can't keep living in this country, existing in this country and living only when we leave, which is literally what a lot of people do, is, leave to go to Bahrain to watch a movie, because they just like the idea of sitting in a group, men and women and kids, and hearing other people laugh at the same spot in a movie, or, as opposed to you can rent a movie and watch watch it in your home, but you can't watch a movie in Saudi Arabia. You know, you can't, in a sense, relax because at all moments you're on. You know, are you doing, saying, being the right thing? And if you don't know what the right thing is, it's another reason people stick close with their family and within their tribe, because you might do or say the wrong thing, so the strain is just too much. It's easier to stay around the people you know. Did I answer you?
So there's no inconsistency in their minds of following it in the country but not outside the country?
There
because it's not part
there
of the-
doesn't seem to be. You know, what we would obviously in the West consider hypocrisy. Yes, sir.
So to what extent, if the oil out of Saudi Arabia, that the fact of the enabling the Islamic society, that is, the corollary to that is when the oil money declines or runs out, would you expect the Islamic society to fall apart to some degree, or does it sustain itself on its own self?
The Saudi people are now express a lot of concern about what's going to happen to us, because they are a very dependent society, and that's the way the government wants it. They provide free education, health care, etc., but it's of low quality. So now Saudis with any ambition want their kid to go to a private school. That costs money. They can't afford it, which is why more women are wanting to work. But yes, there's a cynical Saudi lawyer who says, I think with some accuracy, that as long as oil is $50 a barrel or more, we can do any stupid thing we want and the royal family will survive. When it's less than that, in other words, when they can't afford the money to largely pacify people, then things will change.
Great service.
And that's why people worry about, they now export about 8 million barrels a day, but their own use is rising. And, you know, if the exports fall, and if the U.S. is beginning to become a more popular idea that the environmentalists will actually allow enough fracking that we will become energy independent or almost energy independent, and if that has an effect on world oil prices, and the fact that the world, the West at least, simply is more efficient with energy use now and uses less to do more. If any of those things drive down the oil price and the revenue that they have, it's clearly a concern, obviously, to both the royal family, but especially to Saudis. Yes, sir.
Could you say a word about Sharia law, and to what extent does that govern society in Saudi Arabia?
That is the only law that governs society. But this was, for me, the most interesting, the thing I did not know before spending these last 5 years intensively looking at the society and the way things work, is that, you know, we think of Sharia as being this kind of rigid law, you know, stoning people for adultery, which is not what the Quran says, by the way. That's a hadith. The Quran does not call for stoning people. It can be rigidly applied, but Saudi Arabia is basically an increasingly lawless society. The laws are not clear and they're not enforced. So this is one of the greatest source of unhappiness. People, at least in my 5 years of intensively talking to them and 25 years of going, they're not aspiring for democracy. They're aspiring for what they call justice, and they expect justice actually to come from Islamic law, from the proper implementation of Sharia. And what they say is that, the problem here is that one judge can do whatever he wishes, and the government doesn't enforce the rulings of the courts. So, I visited with a judge who had divorced a Shia Sunni couple. The guy was Shia and she was Sunni, and the husband's version was that her father wanted to marry her off to a cousin, and so he wanted the divorce. Whatever, he went to court, he got the divorce. The guy was still fighting, so I went to see the judge, who demanded that I cover up. And he was a big guy with a big beard, and he said, "Now, I don't want to talk about this. I want to talk about this couple. People make mistakes. I want to talk about something that matters." So I'm looking bug-eyed at him, and he said, now for instance, if you buy a pair of glasses, he looked at my glasses, you buy the best. And I said, well, no, actually, these came from a drugstore. And he said, I buy the best, and you. Now, you want the best religion. And then he proceeded with his Islamic sale for a while, and then eventually he got back to the couple. But, their fate is basically entirely in his hand. And every once in a while, when a case gets too much publicity, the king will intervene and fix it. So there is a very famous example of another couple that were forcibly divorced, and the woman could not go home with her husband and refused to go home with her brothers who had forced the divorce because she thought they would kill her. So she insisted on staying in prison with her 1-year-old kid, and she stayed there for 5 years. And so much was written about it in the West and there that eventually the king's daughter was involved in trying to help the woman, and so the king asked this, for a judicial review, and what do you know? The marriage was ruled legal, but that's the kind of thing that happens to people. So it is Sharia, but it is extremely subjective depending on the judge you get. They're spending $2 billion trying to reform the court system, create more educated lawyers, if you will. They're now letting women go to law school, beginning in 2007. And just this year, 3 years ago, I asked the Minister of Justice, are you going to let women practice? And he said, we're working on it, but just this year they have issued a ruling that says a woman can actually appear in front of one of these Sharia judges if properly covered and represent someone. So that is progress, but it still doesn't get at the enforcement issue. So people's cars get stolen by young kids, joyriding. If you report your car stolen, they don't really want to look for it for at least a week, because the assumption is that they turn up somewhere. And the police who handle those cases, said to me, we don't really want to arrest the poor kids for doing this because the rich kids will get off. So you've got you know, people obeying the laws they want to obey, the police enforcing the laws they want to enforce or not enforcing. It surprised me, okay, how lawless it is, and the way.
So, what's been the reaction to your book in Saudi Arabia, and are you allowed back in?
Saudis don't read, so it'll probably be a while before. I've had two grandsons react, one who liked it and one who said he didn't agree with anything in it. And I hope to test I have a 5-year multiple entry visa. So I hope to go back in January or February, so I'll tell you then whether. Yes.
Is there any concern or awareness of the problems that the explosion of population is bringing? Are there any efforts to sort of hold down the population?
No. I mean, the birth rate has fallen a little bit, but when I started going there in '78, you know, people would tell me, now the Saudis are going to tell you that there are 7 million Saudis, don't believe it, there's not a person over 5 million, but now the census shows there are 19.6 million, the 2010 census. I mean, they have really, they're living longer and they're reproducing, you know, 5, 6, 7 children. It's not abnormal. And young women say their mothers advise them, if you don't have children, he'll take another wife. So, you know, there's another form of pressures. But to my knowledge, they are now concerned about birth defects that are coming from, you know, too many cousin marriages, which is basically the preferred marriage for the royal family or anybody else is to marry your cousin. So there is an effort to look at that, to require blood tests to get married and that kind of thing, but not to attempt to control the production of children. Yes, sir.
What is their relation with their neighbors?
What is their relation with their neighbors? He was asking.
How do they relate? Are there peace? Are they conflicts?
Well, the king, since becoming king in 2005, has settled all the little, you know, kind of border quarrels and things they had with Qatar and Yemen and different places. But their big concern is Iran. And it's not so much a concern of the Iranians invading, it's a concern of the Iranians as Shias somehow being seen as the real Muslims, the protectors, the custodian of the two holy mosques. And I think that's a big part of their concern about the Iranian nuclear program, is they think it will elevate Iran's stature. And anything that, in their mind, diminishes their legitimacy as the protectors and propagators of the proper Islam, because if they do lose that, I mean, they are just another tribe. And so that concerns them a lot. They obviously are very close to Bahrain. When the turmoil occurred there between the population, which is majority Shia, and the Sunni rulers in Bahrain, the Saudis sent troops in. They are very protective of Bahrain because they don't want any monarchy falling. Their position is, we're not dictators like Mubarak or Assad, you know. We're monarchies, and we monarchs are beloved. so we don't get overthrown. So I'm sure they're worried about King Abdullah in Jordan now, and will give him some money to help prop himself up. And they in Qatar are constantly feuding in political ways. I mean, the Qataris have become very active in the Middle East, and the Saudis like to think that they should be the diplomatic leaders in the Arab world. It's not going to be Egypt. Of all of us little guys, we're big, and all of you Gulf countries are little, so stay in your place. But they don't have great disputes with anybody. They're fixated on the Shias in Bahrain, from Iran, influencing the Shias in Saudi Arabia. And anything that diminishes, raises Iran's stature and risks diminishing theirs as Islamic leaders. Is polygamy still the major form of marriage, and is there a middle class? There is a middle class, but it's as in educated people. Their income level has shrunk. They had a big stock market crash in 2006. And you know, everything becomes more expensive in Saudi Arabia, like everywhere else, and wages don't keep up, if you will, because of this huge foreign workforce that works for much lower wages than a normal economy would produce if the Saudi men and women were working. And so much of their wealth is going, these workers send the money back to India, Bangladesh, etc. They're not spending it in the Saudi economy as Saudi women would be doing if they were earning wages. So it's that distorts the economy. Oh, polygamy. I would say it's decreasingly, I mean, among the, you know, the royal family, the whole idea, the old founder, you know, had, I mean, he didn't even know, I think, how many wives he had had. I mean, he's quoted in one of the books as saying, you know, 300 and something. But he had 22 sort of proper wives where it wasn't just a political one-night marriage. And then you take care of the woman and the tribe thereafter to enhance your political power. But, you know, so the royals still marry a lot, but the grandson generation, I'm sure there are grandsons who they have serial marriages, but they don't have multiple marriages. I mean, most of them have been, you know, married a number of times, but like Americans do it one after the other. Prince Saud, who graduated from Princeton University, who's the foreign minister, is fond of describing the U.S.-Saudi relationship and the change in it. He said, by saying, we used to have a Catholic marriage, and now we have a Muslim marriage, meaning that the Saudis are free to have more wives, so they have China and Russia and Europe, and we're still the first wife, but we're no longer the only wife. Do you want to?
I just want to know how, what do Saudis really do to work?
I'm sorry, I can't.
Like, how do they earn their money? Does the government really give them part of the proceeds from the oil, or do they have positions?
She asked, how do Saudis earn their money? Unemployment is very high among young people. So most Saudis that are employed by the government. So they're in the military. There's a Saudi National Guard and a defense department and an interior ministry, all of whom hire large numbers of Saudi males. So if you're not working in one of those three security areas, you're teaching, working in a government office, you're somehow getting your salary from the government, because only 10% of Saudis are working in the private sector. Young people get, if they go to university, they get free education and they get a stipend from the government. And after the Arab Spring, the king returned home from the hospital and passed out $130 billion, which was 85% of the annual budget, so 85% on top. Giving more money to the religious establishment, to mosques, to create fatwa centers, like we have these, ATM machines. You would have these machines all over where you could just type in your question to the religious and it would spit out advice on everything, what to do if you masturbated during Ramadan, or you can read the answers to these things on the religious website. Money to, for the first time, create a minimum wage for Saudis to try to deal with this fact that the foreign workforce, unless it's the very white collar, are willing to work for much lower wages. But they are unhappy, many Saudis, because they don't have a job, because they can't afford a house. 60% of people don't have homes because land is so expensive. So young people basically live with their parents, and they can't go to a movie if you're a young man, because there are no movies. You can't go to a shopping mall because you might prey on young women, so you go to each other's houses and watch TV and play computer games, and some of them get bored enough to go steal cars and race them, or I met a thief who I spent time on the car theft issue. This guy was 40 years old and he had his first job. And his job was being a fixer. You carry papers around. I need my driver's license renewed. I don't want to stand in line for 4 hours. I hire him to go stand in line for me. So he obviously wasn't making much money, but this is a more acceptable thing to do than work in McDonald's or do any kind of service job. I had a Saudi who went to Harvard who said, some Saudis are beginning to do service jobs. He said, I had dinner in a restaurant last night and a Saudi waited on me. I was so humiliated, I didn't know what to do. I'm not actually humiliated when an American waits on me in a restaurant, but the end, all right. Thank you all very much.